The street hummed with the subdued energy of early morning. The sun, not yet fully committed to the day, cast a pale golden glow over the rows of modest homes. The rhythmic hiss of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a restless dog created a soundscape of routine, the kind that wrapped itself around the neighborhood like a familiar, comforting blanket. But for all its ordinary charm, Sycamore Lane had its secrets. Amelia's house sat near the end of the street, a weathered colonial-style structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch swing that creaked ominously in the wind. From the outside, it looked like any other house on the block, but inside, it was a pressure cooker of tension and unspoken words. Amelia was 15, with a mop of unruly auburn hair and freckles that dotted her face like constellations. She had always been an introspective girl, more at home in her sketchbooks than among her peers. But lately, she had become even more withdrawn. Her parents, Margaret and Dennis, were no strangers to conflict. They had once been vibrant and full of dreams, but life, with its endless bills, long hours, and unfulfilled promises, had drained the color from their marriage. Their arguments, once passionate and rare, had grown into a daily routine of bitterness and blame. Margaret's voice was sharp, her words often laced with venom. Dennis, on the other hand, simmered quietly until he exploded, his anger like a sudden storm. Amelia tried to stay invisible during their fights, retreating to her room where she could drown out the shouting with her headphones. But last night had been different. Last night, the shouting had escalated to something more sinister. She had heard the unmistakable sound of something shattering, followed by a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. When she had crept downstairs, she found her mother sobbing on the kitchen floor, a broken plate scattered around her like the remnants of a bomb. That morning, as the garbage truck rumbled down the street, Amelia stood at her bedroom window, her heart pounding. She hadn't slept. The image of her mother's tear-streaked face was burned into her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The garbage truck came to a halt in front of her house, its hydraulic arm reaching out to grab the bin like a metallic claw. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard and kind eyes, stepped out to adjust the bin. His name was Gus, and he had been working this route for over a decade. He knew the neighborhood well, knew which houses always forgot to take their bins out, which ones overstuffed them, and which ones never seemed to throw anything away. He had seen Amelia before, though only in passing. She was usually on her way to school, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her gaze fixed on the ground. She struck him as a lonely kid, the kind who carried more on her shoulders than she should. This morning, as he adjusted the bin, he looked up and saw her standing on the porch, barefoot and trembling. Amelia didn't remember deciding to go outside. One moment she was staring out her window, and the next she was standing on the porch, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The door clicked shut behind her, and she realized she had left without her coat. Her hands were shaking, but it wasn't from the cold. She felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, about to jump but not knowing if there was water or rocks below. "Hey!" Gus called out, his voice warm and reassuring. "You okay, kid?" The words hit her like a jolt, breaking through the fog in her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. Instead, she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. Gus's brow furrowed. He took a step closer, careful not to startle her. "You need help? Want me to call someone?" That was all it took. Amelia ran down the steps and across the yard, her bare feet crunching against the frost-covered grass. She threw herself into Gus's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The smell of diesel and sweat clung to him, but she didn't care. It was the first time in months she had felt safe. Gus was stunned but instinctively wrapped his arms around her, patting her back awkwardly. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're okay." The moment didn't last long. Within minutes, the scene had drawn the attention of the neighbors. Curtains twitched, and faces appeared in windows, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. One of them, Mrs. Peterson from across the street, hurried outside, her phone already in hand. "What's going on?" she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. Gus glanced up, his protective instincts kicking in. "Not sure yet," he replied. "Think this kid needs some help." Mrs. Peterson nodded and began dialing. "I'll call the police. They'll know what to do." Amelia tensed at the word police, her sobs turning into hiccups. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't call them. Please." But it was too late. The police were already on their way. When the first cruiser arrived, the officer's expression shifted from professional detachment to genuine concern as he took in the scene. Amelia, still clinging to Gus, looked like a ghost of herself, her pale face streaked with tears and her hair a disheveled mess. Gus stepped back as the officer approached, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone gentle. Gus gestured toward Amelia. "She came running out to me, crying. Doesn't seem like she wants to go back inside." The officer crouched down to Amelia's level, his voice softening. "Hi there. I'm Officer Daniels. Can you tell me your name?" Amelia hesitated, her eyes darting toward her house. She could see her mother peeking out from behind the curtains, her face pale and drawn. Finally, she whispered, "Amelia." "Okay, Amelia. Can you tell me why you ran outside?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. Gus stepped in, his voice steady. "I think she's scared, officer. Might be something going on inside the house." Daniels nodded and signaled to his partner, who began walking toward the house. Margaret stepped outside before he could reach the porch, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice tight. The officer stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am, we're just here to make sure everything's okay. Your daughter seems pretty upset." Margaret's eyes flicked to Amelia, who was now sitting on the curb with Gus beside her. She's a teenager," Margaret said with a strained smile. "You know how they can be. Always so dramatic." Daniels didn't look convinced. "Mind if we come in and take a look around?" Margaret hesitated, her facade cracking. "Do you have a warrant?" "We don't need one if we believe a child's safety is at risk," Daniels replied evenly. Margaret's shoulders sagged and she stepped aside. "Fine, but you're not going to find anything." As the officers entered the house, Amelia's heart raced. She knew what they would find. The street hummed with the subdued energy of early morning. The sun, not yet fully committed to the day, cast a pale golden glow over the rows of modest homes. The rhythmic hiss of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a restless dog created a soundscape of routine, the kind that wrapped itself around the neighborhood like a familiar, comforting blanket. But for all its ordinary charm, Sycamore Lane had its secrets. Amelia's house sat near the end of the street, a weathered colonial-style structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch swing that creaked ominously in the wind. From the outside, it looked like any other house on the block, but inside, it was a pressure cooker of tension and unspoken words. Amelia was 15, with a mop of unruly auburn hair and freckles that dotted her face like constellations. She had always been an introspective girl, more at home in her sketchbooks than among her peers. But lately, she had become even more withdrawn. Her parents, Margaret and Dennis, were no strangers to conflict. They had once been vibrant and full of dreams, but life, with its endless bills, long hours, and unfulfilled promises, had drained the color from their marriage. Their arguments, once passionate and rare, had grown into a daily routine of bitterness and blame. Margaret's voice was sharp, her words often laced with venom. Dennis, on the other hand, simmered quietly until he exploded, his anger like a sudden storm. Amelia tried to stay invisible during their fights, retreating to her room where she could drown out the shouting with her headphones. But last night had been different. Last night, The shouting had escalated to something more sinister. She had heard the unmistakable sound of something shattering, followed by a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. When she had crept downstairs, she found her mother sobbing on the kitchen floor, a broken plate scattered around her like the remnants of a bomb. That morning, as the garbage truck rumbled down the street, Amelia stood at her bedroom window, her heart pounding. She hadn't slept. The image of her mother's tear-streaked face was burned into her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The garbage truck came to a halt in front of her house, its hydraulic arm reaching out to grab the bin like a metallic claw. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard and kind eyes, stepped out to adjust the bin. His name was Gus, and he had been working this route for over a decade. He knew the neighborhood well, knew which houses always forgot to take their bins out, which ones overstuffed them, and which ones never seemed to throw anything away. He had seen Amelia before, though only in passing. She was usually on her way to school, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her gaze fixed on the ground. She struck him as a lonely kid, the kind who carried more on her shoulders than she should. This morning, as he adjusted the bin, he looked up and saw her standing on the porch, barefoot and trembling. Amelia didn't remember deciding to go outside. One moment she was staring out her window, and the next she was standing on the porch, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The door clicked shut behind her, and she realized she had left without her coat. Her hands were shaking, but it wasn't from the cold. She felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, about to jump but not knowing if there was water or rocks below. "Hey!" Gus called out, his voice warm and reassuring. "You okay, kid?" The words hit her like a jolt, breaking through the fog in her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. Instead, she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. Gus's brow furrowed. He took a step closer, careful not to startle her. "You need help? Want me to call someone?" That was all it took. Amelia ran down the steps and across the yard, her bare feet crunching against the frost-covered grass. She threw herself into Gus's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The smell of diesel and sweat clung to him, but she didn't care. It was the first time in months she had felt safe. Gus was stunned but instinctively wrapped his arms around her, patting her back awkwardly. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're okay." The moment didn't last long. Within minutes, the scene had drawn the attention of the neighbors. Curtains twitched, and faces appeared in windows, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. One of them, Mrs. Peterson from across the street, hurried outside, her phone already in hand. "What's going on?" she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. Gus glanced up, his protective instincts kicking in. "Not sure yet," he replied. "Think this kid needs some help." Mrs. Peterson nodded and began dialing. "I'll call the police. They'll know what to do." Amelia tensed at the word police, her sobs turning into hiccups. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't call them. Please." But it was too late. The police were already on their way. When the first cruiser arrived, the officer's expression shifted from professional detachment to genuine concern as he took in the scene. Amelia, still clinging to Gus, looked like a ghost of herself, her pale face streaked with tears and her hair a disheveled mess. Gus stepped back as the officer approached, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone gentle. Gus gestured toward Amelia. "She came running out to me, crying. Doesn't seem like she wants to go back inside." The officer crouched down to Amelia's level, his voice softening. "Hi there. I'm Officer Daniels. Can you tell me your name?" Amelia hesitated, her eyes darting toward her house. She could see her mother peeking out from behind the curtains, her face pale and drawn. Finally, she whispered, "Amelia." "Okay, Amelia. Can you tell me why you ran outside?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. Gus stepped in, his voice steady. I think she's scared, officer. Might be something going on inside the house. Daniels nodded and signaled to his partner, who began walking toward the house. Margaret stepped outside before he could reach the porch, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice tight. The officer stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am, we're just here to make sure everything's okay. Your daughter seems pretty upset." Margaret's eyes flicked to Amelia, who was now sitting on the curb with Gus beside her. She's a teenager," Margaret said with a strained smile. "You know how they can be. Always so dramatic." Daniels didn't look convinced. "Mind if we come in and take a look around?" Margaret hesitated, her facade cracking. "Do you have a warrant?" "We don't need one if we believe a child's safety is at risk," Daniels replied evenly. Margaret's shoulders sagged, and she stepped aside. "Fine, but you're not going to find anything." As the officers entered the house, Amelia's heart raced. She knew what they would find. The broken plate had been cleaned up, but the tension in the air was as thick as ever. She wanted to believe that things would get better, that her family could go back to the way it was before. But deep down, she knew that some things, once broken, could never be fixed. Minutes later, one of the officers emerged, his expression grim. He exchanged a glance with Daniels, who nodded and turned back to Amelia. "Amelia, we're going to take you somewhere safe for a little while," he said gently. "Is that okay with you?" She nodded, her tears finally slowing. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the police shut down the street and more neighbors emerged to gawk, Amelia climbed into the back of the cruiser, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. Gus watched the car drive away, a pang of sadness in his chest. He didn't know what would happen to the girl, but he hoped she'd find the peace she was searching for. As he climbed back into his truck and continued his route, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The sound of the garbage truck's screeching brakes echoed down the quiet suburban street, mixing with the muffled sobs of young Clara Benton as she bolted out the front door. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands, her tear-streaked face carried a desperation that immediately caught the attention of Joe Grady, the seasoned garbage man who had worked this route for nearly 2 decades. He stopped mid-motion, a black garbage bag still in his gloved hand, and turned toward the girl. "Clara," he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "What's wrong?" Clara could barely speak through her sobs. She thrust the paper toward Joe, her hand shaking so violently that the note, written in sharp, hurried letters, nearly fell to the ground. Joe set the garbage bag aside and gently took the note, his eyes narrowing as he read the ominous message. "Asterisk, you took what doesn't belong to you. Now we're coming for what matters most." Asterisk. Joe's stomach dropped. He looked back at Clara, who was struggling to breathe through her tears. "Where did you get this?" he asked, crouching down to meet her eyes. "It was on our porch this morning," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was a prank, but then Mom didn't come home last night." Joe's mind raced. He knew Clara's mother, Rachel Benton, well enough to know that she was a reliable, hard-working single parent who would never disappear without warning. Something wasn't right. "Go inside and lock the door," Joe instructed, his voice firm but kind. "Don't open it for anyone except the police. I'm calling them right now." Clara hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded and ran back toward the house. Joe pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his callous fingers fumbling slightly as he hit the buttons. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random threat. Something darker was at play. Minutes later, police cruisers swarmed the street, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Detective Elena Vasquez, a sharp-eyed investigator with a reputation for cracking tough cases, stepped out of an unmarked car. Her presence immediately commanded attention. "Who found the note?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. Joe stepped forward, handing her the crumpled paper. "Clara Benton gave it to me." She said her mom didn't come home last night. Vasquez's brow furrowed as she read the note. Where's Clara now? Inside the house, Joe replied. I told her to lock the door. Good call, Vasquez said. She signaled to one of the uniformed officers. Stay with the girl. Make sure she's safe. Turning back to Joe, she added, I'll need to ask you some questions. Joe nodded, his expression grim. Anything I can do to help? As Vasquez began her preliminary investigation, the sense of unease in the neighborhood grew. Neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering among themselves, their curiosity mingled with fear. It wasn't every day that the police shut down their quiet cul-de-sac. Inside the Benton house, Clara sat huddled on the couch, clutching a pillow tightly to her chest. The officer assigned to watch over her, a kind-faced woman named Officer Jensen, tried to offer reassurance. We're going to find your mom, Jensen said softly. Do you remember anything unusual about last night? Anything that might help us? Clara shook her head. She was supposed to come home after her shift at the diner. She texted me at 9 o'clock saying she'd be late, but that was it. She never came home. Jensen nodded, jotting down notes. And this note, you found it this morning? Yes, Clara whispered. It was just sitting on the porch. I thought it was some stupid prank at first. But now, her voice broke, and she buried her face in the pillow. Meanwhile, outside, Vasquez's investigation was uncovering more questions than answers. Joe, still standing near his truck, recounted everything he knew about Rachel and Clara. She's a good mom, he said. Works hard, keeps to herself. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. Did she ever mention anything unusual? Vasquez pressed. Problems at work, issues with neighbors, anything like that? Joe shook his head. Not that I know of, but he hesitated, glancing toward the house. There was something odd a few weeks ago. She mentioned someone was asking questions about her at the diner. She didn't go into details, but she seemed uneasy. Vasquez's expression darkened. Did she say who it was? No. Just said it was a guy she'd never seen before. The detective filed that piece of information away, her instincts telling her it was significant. Turning to the other officers, she began organizing a search for Rachel. They'd need to start at the diner and work backward, piecing together her movements from the previous night. As the investigation deepened, a new twist emerged. One of the officers discovered a set of tire tracks on the street near the Benton's driveway. The tracks didn't match any of the neighbors' vehicles and appeared fresh, as if someone had sped away in a hurry. Vasquez ordered the tracks to be photographed and analyzed, hoping they might lead to a breakthrough. Back inside the house, Clara's fear began to morph into determination. She couldn't sit idly by while her mother's fate remained uncertain. Quietly, she retrieved her mom's laptop from the kitchen table and began searching for clues. Her mom's email account was still open, and Clara's heart sank as she saw an unread message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, Time's up. Her hand shaking, Clara clicked on the email. The message was brief but chilling. Asterisk, you thought you could hide forever. You were wrong. See you soon. Asterisk. Clara's breath hitched. She knew she should show the email to the police, but something about the message felt personal, as if it were meant for her eyes only. Against her better judgment, she replied, Asterisk, who are you? What do you want? Asterisk. Seconds later, the email bounced back. The sender's address was no longer active. Clara stared at the screen, her mind racing. Whoever had sent the message didn't just want to scare her. They wanted her attention. But why? What had her mom done to deserve this? And who was coming for them? Outside, the police were methodically expanding their search, but time felt like an enemy. Joe watched as the neighborhood's sense of security unraveled, the weight of Clara's fear pressing heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something or someone out of place on his route recently. He just couldn't pinpoint what it was. As the day wore on, the twists continued to pile up. A call came in from the diner. One of Rachel's co-workers had seen her get into a dark SUV after her shift. The driver's face was obscured, but the co-worker swore Rachel didn't seem frightened. Just wary, as if she knew the person but didn't entirely trust him. When Vasquez relayed this information to Clara, the girl's reaction was immediate. "She told me she'd never get into a car with someone she didn't trust," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It has to be someone she knows. Someone who's been in our lives." That revelation opened a chilling new possibility. The threat might not be from a stranger at all. The enemy could be someone Rachel had let into her world, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had come. As dusk fell, the once bustling street settled into an uneasy stillness, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of police radios. Detective Elena Vasquez paced the Benton's front yard, her sharp mind sorting through the tangled threads of the case. She had sent officers to canvass the neighborhood and dig deeper into Rachel Benton's life. But every lead seemed to raise more questions than answers. Inside the house, Clara sat with Officer Jensen, her face pale but determined. She hadn't told the officer about the emails she'd found on her mom's laptop. Instead, she kept turning the cryptic message over in her mind, wondering who could harbor such hostility toward her mom. Clara had always known her mother to be cautious and private, but now it seemed as though Rachel had been hiding something dangerous. Joe Grady, meanwhile, couldn't shake his own sense of guilt. He had always taken pride in knowing the people on his route, feeling like a part of their lives in some small way. But now, standing on the sidelines of this unfolding nightmare, he felt powerless. The note Clara had given him played over and over in his mind. Who had written it, and why? As Joe leaned against his truck, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Joe's pulse quickened. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him. But the street was empty save for the police. Whoever had sent the message wanted to intimidate him. But into staying out of what exactly? Joe had no intention of backing down, not when Clara and Rachel were in danger. Across the neighborhood, Detective Vasquez was piecing together a troubling timeline. Rachel's co-workers at the diner described her as reliable but often distracted, especially in the past few months. One waitress mentioned seeing Rachel argue with a man in the parking lot several weeks ago. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the memory seemed significant. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, the waitress said. Dark hair, kind of rough-looking. Rachel didn't seem scared exactly, but she definitely wasn't happy to see him. The description was vague, but it gave Vasquez a starting point. She sent out an APB for the man and began reviewing surveillance footage from the diner. It didn't take long to spot the SUV that Rachel had supposedly entered on the night she disappeared. The vehicle's license plate was partially obscured, but a blurry decal on the rear window caught Vasquez's eye. It looked like the logo of a local towing company. At the same time, Clara made a decision. She couldn't sit by while the police sifted through clues at their own pace. She needed answers now. Slipping away from Officer Jensen's watchful eyes, she grabbed her backpack and headed for the one place she thought might hold more secrets: her mom's bedroom. Clara hadn't spent much time in there. Rachel was always particular about her personal space. But now, as she pushed open the door, Clara felt a strange mix of trepidation and determination. The room was neat, almost too neat, as though her mom had been careful to leave no trace of anything out of the ordinary. Still, Clara's eyes scanned the space for anything that might stand out. It didn't take long to find it. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard was a small metal lockbox. Clara's heart pounded as she lifted it out, her fingers brushing against the cool, unyielding surface. The box was locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the board. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, and a worn journal. The photos were of Rachel, but they weren't the kind Clara was used to seeing. These showed her mom with strangers in unfamiliar places: a beach, a city skyline, A dimly lit bar. Clara flipped through them, her confusion growing. Who were these people? And why had her mom hidden these pictures? The journal was even more unsettling. As Clara skimmed the entries, she realized her mom had been keeping secrets for years. References to starting over and protecting Clara were scrawled across the pages, along with cryptic mentions of someone named Dee. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, sent chills down Clara's spine. Asterisk, he found me. I don't know how, but he did. I have to be careful. Clara's safety is all that matters now. Asterisk, meanwhile, Vasquez's investigation into the SUV led her to a local towing yard on the outskirts of town. The owner, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, confirmed that the vehicle in question had been towed to their lot a few days earlier. According to their records, it belonged to a man named Daniel Cross, a name that immediately raised red flags for Vasquez. Cross had a criminal record that included assault and extortion, and he had recently been released on parole. Any idea where he is now? Vasquez asked. The owner shook his head. Haven't seen him since he picked up the SUV. But if he's mixed up in something, you'll want to talk to his old crew. They hang out at that dive bar on 5th. Vasquez nodded, already formulating a plan. But as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Jensen. Clara was missing. Panic surged through Vasquez as she raced back to the Benton house. The officer's explanation was terse but clear. Clara had slipped away while her back was turned. They were combing the neighborhood, but so far there was no sign of her. Clara, unaware of the chaos her disappearance had caused, was now following her own trail of breadcrumbs. The photos and journal entries had pointed her toward an old storage facility on the edge of town. Her mom had mentioned it in one of the entries, describing it as a place where she kept what couldn't be left behind. By the time Clara arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of storage units. She found the one her mom had described and tried the combination lock. To her relief, it opened easily. Inside, the unit was cluttered with boxes and furniture, but one item stood out. A large wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate patterns. Clara lifted the lid and gasped. Inside was a collection of old letters, passports with different names, and a handgun. Her mom's face stared back at her from each passport photo, though the names were unfamiliar. It was like staring at a stranger's life. Clara's mind raced. Had her mom been on the run? From who? Before she could process the discovery, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the storage unit. Clara's heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to close the chest. Peering through the narrow gap in the door, she saw a figure moving in the shadows. It wasn't a police officer. Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have come here. Fear surged through her veins as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever was outside knew she was here. She needed to get out, but the only way was past the figure in the shadows. Gathering her courage, Clara clutched one of the heavy candlesticks from the chest and prepared to defend herself. At the same time, Vasquez was piecing together Clara's likely destination. The journal, discovered by Officer Jensen, mentioned the storage unit, and Vasquez wasted no time heading there with backup. As the squad cars approached, their headlights illuminated the figure outside the unit. It was a man, his features obscured by a hood. Police, hands where I can see them, Vasquez shouted. The man bolted, disappearing into the maze of storage units. Vasquez ordered her officers to pursue him while she approached the unit. Inside, she found Clara, trembling but unharmed. Clara, are you okay? Vasquez asked, her voice gentle. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. I found this, she said, motioning to the open chest. I think my mom was running from someone, but I don't know who. As Vasquez examined the contents of the chest, her suspicions deepened. Rachel Benton's life was far more complicated than anyone had realized, and the answers lay buried in her past. But with a dangerous man on the loose and more questions than ever, One thing was clear. The stakes had just been raised. The events of the evening spiraled rapidly, leaving every character on edge. Detective Vasquez now faced a pressing dilemma. The hooded man had eluded capture, and the fragments of evidence only hinted at the danger Rachel Benton had been trying to escape. Clara, visibly shaken but resolute, clung to the idea that her mother's secrets held the key to her safety. Joe, meanwhile, grappled with his growing involvement in a situation that had veered far beyond his control. Back at the station, Vasquez reviewed the contents of the chest retrieved from the storage unit. Among the forged passports and letters, one document stood out. A faded photograph of Rachel with a young man, standing in front of a rustic house with a distinctive weather vane. Scrawled on the back was a date from 20 years earlier and the initials DC. "Daniel Cross," Vasquez murmured. She turned to an officer and barked, "Find out if Cross has any known properties or connections to locations with a weather vane like this. We need to move fast." Clara, now at the station, had reluctantly handed over the journal. She watched as Vasquez combed through it with a laser focus, her own mind still reeling from the night's events. "Detective," Clara said quietly, "I think my mom was scared of this Daniel guy. She wrote that he found her. But I don't know why she'd hide all this stuff if she wasn't in danger." Vasquez nodded. "It's starting to look like your mother was trying to protect you from something or someone in her past. Cross might be the link we need, but I'll need you to tell me everything you remember about her behavior recently. Anything unusual." As Clara recounted moments that now seemed significant in hindsight, Rachel's constant checking of the locks, her hesitance to leave Clara alone. Joe arrived at the station, determined to help. He handed Vasquez his phone, showing her the threatening text message he'd received earlier. "I don't know who sent this, but it feels connected to all this," Joe said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Vasquez frowned. "It's likely someone trying to scare you off, which means you know more than you think. Did Rachel ever mention someone following her or strange behavior from people on your route?" Joe shook his head. "No, but she'd sometimes stop to talk longer than most people. She was always friendly, but there was this one guy I saw her arguing with a couple of times, same description you mentioned earlier. Could be Cross." Just then, an officer burst into the room with an update. "Detective, we traced a connection. Cross's family owned a farmhouse about 30 miles from here. It's abandoned, but neighbors reported seeing lights there last week." Vasquez's eyes narrowed. "That's our lead. Assemble a team." Turning to Clara, she added, "We're going to find your mom. I promise." The drive to the farmhouse was tense. Clara insisted on coming along despite Vasquez's protests. Joe, too, had joined, unwilling to sit idly by when he might be needed. As they neared the property, the sight of the weather vane silhouetted against the moonlight confirmed they were in the right place. Vasquez signaled her team to approach cautiously. The house loomed ominously, its windows dark and uninviting. Clara stayed in the car with Joe, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat as she watched the officers fan out across the property. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. Vasquez motioned for 2 officers to follow her inside while the others secured the perimeter. The creak of the front door echoed through the night as they entered, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. On the second floor, Vasquez found a room that appeared hastily vacated. A chair was overturned, and a coil of rope lay discarded on the floor. But what caught her attention was a single sheet of paper pinned to the wall. It was a note, written in a hurried scrawl, "You're too late. She's gone." Outside, Clara's patience snapped. Ignoring Joe's attempts to stop her, she bolted from the car and toward the house. Joe cursed under his breath and followed her, catching up just as she reached the porch. "Clara, wait. Let the police handle this," he pleaded. But Clara shook her head. "My mom might be in there. I can't just sit and do nothing." Before Joe could respond, a noise from the nearby barn drew their attention. It was faint but unmistakable. the sound of muffled voices. Clara's eyes widened, and without thinking, she ran toward the barn. Joe followed, his heart pounding as he prayed they weren't walking into a trap. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and oil. In the dim light of Joe's flashlight, they saw a figure tied to a chair. It was Rachel. Her eyes widened as she saw them, and she shook her head frantically, trying to warn them of something. "Mom!" Clara cried, rushing forward. But before she could reach Rachel, a shadow moved behind them. Joe turned just in time to see a man step out of the darkness, a gun in his hand. "Not another step," the man growled. His face was rough, his eyes cold and calculating. It was Daniel Cross. Outside, Vasquez's radio crackled to life. One of her officers had spotted movement near the barn. Realizing Clara and Joe were missing, Vasquez sprinted toward the structure, her gun drawn. Inside, Cross smirked. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, leveling the gun at Joe. "But now, I guess I'll have to deal with you, too." Clara stepped in front of Joe, her hands raised. "Please don't hurt him. Just let my mom go. You don't have to do this." Cross sneered. "You think you know what your mom's done? What she's taken from me? She deserves everything coming to her." Before Cross could say more, Vasquez's voice rang out. "Drop the weapon, Cross." "It's over." Cross froze, his eyes darting between Vasquez and his hostages. For a moment, the tension was unbearable. Then, in a sudden, desperate move, he lunged toward Clara, pulling her close as a shield. Vasquez didn't hesitate. With precise aim, she fired a single shot, hitting Cross in the shoulder. He cried out, dropping the gun and releasing Clara. Officers swarmed in, subduing him as Vasquez rushed to check on Clara and Rachel. Rachel, though shaken, managed a weak smile as Clara untied her. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I never wanted you to get caught up in this." Clara hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It doesn't matter now, Mom. You're safe. That's all that matters." As the police secured the scene and Cross was taken into custody, Vasquez couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. But for now, she was content knowing that Clara and Rachel were safe, and the man who had terrorized them was finally behind bars. The true depths of Rachel's past would take time to uncover, but one thing was clear. The strength of a mother's love had prevailed against the odds. The farmhouse was still buzzing with activity as police officers gathered evidence and secured the perimeter. But for Clara, the events of the past hour were far from over. Even with Daniel Cross in custody, the questions surrounding her mother's past and the dangers they faced were unresolved. Rachel sat in the back of an ambulance, her face pale and her hands trembling as paramedics checked her over. Clara stood beside her, refusing to let go of her mother's hand. Detective Vasquez approached, her face a mix of relief and determination. "Rachel, I need you to tell me everything," she said. "If there are others involved, we need to know now." Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering to Clara. "It's complicated," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cross wasn't working alone. There's someone else, someone more dangerous. They call him the broker. He's the one who orchestrated everything." Vasquez's jaw tightened. "Who is he? What does he want?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't know his real name. I only know that he's been after me for years. I used to work for him, back when I was desperate and made some bad choices. I thought I got away, but he's been hunting me ever since." Cross was just his enforcer. Clara's grip on her mother's hand tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you keep all of this a secret?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I was trying to protect you, sweetheart. The less you knew, the safer you were. I never wanted this life to touch you." Before Clara could respond, an officer interrupted. "Detective, we've got a situation. There's been a break-in at the station." Vasquez's head snapped up. "What?" The officer nodded grimly. Someone breached the evidence room. They took the chest from the storage unit and left a message. This isn't over. Rachel's face drained of color. It's him, she whispered. The broker. He's making his move. The drive back to the city was tense. Vasquez's team was on high alert, monitoring every possible lead. Rachel, Clara, and Joe rode in the back of a police SUV, escorted by 2 patrol cars. Vasquez had insisted they relocate to a secure location until the broker could be identified and apprehended. Joe broke the silence. Rachel, if this guy is as dangerous as you say, why haven't the police caught him before? Rachel sighed. Because he's a ghost. He operates through intermediaries, never showing his face or leaving a trail. Even when I worked for him, I never met him in person. He's always a step ahead. Clara's mind raced. The pieces of her mother's life she never understood were falling into place, but they painted a terrifying picture. So what do we do now? She asked. We stay together, Rachel said firmly, and we trust the police to keep us safe. But even as she said it, Rachel's eyes betrayed her doubt. She knew the broker wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. At the safe house, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, the group was met by additional officers. The house was outfitted with surveillance equipment and reinforced locks, but it still felt vulnerable. Vasquez stayed behind to oversee security, determined to ensure no more mistakes were made. Hours passed in uneasy quiet. Clara sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street, while Rachel paced the room. Joe, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. You know, he said, for a garbage man, I've seen more action in the past 2 days than I ever signed up for. Clara managed a small smile. You didn't have to come with us, she said. But I'm glad you did. Joe shrugged. Hey! Someone's got to make sure you two don't get into more trouble. Before anyone could respond, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the hum of surveillance equipment abruptly stopped. Stay here, Vasquez ordered, drawing her weapon. She signaled for 2 officers to follow her as she moved to investigate. Rachel pulled Clara close, her heart pounding. It's him, Rachel whispered. He's here. Joe grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and handed it to Rachel. Stay low, he said. I'll keep watch by the door. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Outside, Vasquez and her team searched the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found no sign of an intruder, but Vasquez's gut told her they were being watched. Inside, Clara's fear turned to frustration. We can't just sit here, she said. We have to do something. What can we do? Rachel asked. We're not trained for this. Clara looked at her mother, determination in her eyes. Maybe not, but we know more about him than anyone else. If we can figure out what he wants, we might be able to stop him. Rachel hesitated. Clara's courage reminded her of herself at that age, but she couldn't bear the thought of putting her daughter in more danger. We'll wait for Vasquez, she said finally. Just then, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the back of the house. Joe spun toward the noise, flashlight in hand. Stay here, he said, moving toward the sound. Clara followed before Rachel could stop her. They found the source of the noise in the kitchen, a broken window and a small, blinking device on the floor. Joe picked it up carefully, his face pale. It's a tracker, he said. He knows exactly where we are. Before they could react, Vasquez burst into the room. We need to move, she said. Now, the group hurried to the front of the house, but as they reached the door, a shadowy figure stepped into view, blocking their path. The man's face was obscured, but his presence radiated menace. Going somewhere, he drawled, his voice cold and mocking. Rachel froze, her worst fears realized. The broker, she whispered. Clara stepped forward, her fear replaced by a surge of defiance. Leave us alone, she shouted. We don't have what you want. The broker chuckled. Oh, but you do, he said. And I'll take it, one way or another. Before he could make his move, Vasquez raised her weapon. "Freeze!" she commanded. The broker hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The standoff hung in the air, the tension crackling like electricity. "Make your choice," Vasquez said. "This ends now." The broker smirked, then reached into his coat. Time seemed to slow as Vasquez reacted, her finger tightening on the trigger. The moment that followed would change everything. Time seemed frozen as Vasquez's finger tightened on the trigger. The broker's hand paused inside his coat, and the room held its collective breath. Clara's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything, to tip the balance in their favor. The broker's smirk deepened. Slowly, he pulled out not a weapon but a small, metallic device. "This," he said, his voice icy, "is what you've been guarding so dearly. Did you even know what was inside that chest?" Rachel's eyes darted to the device, recognition dawning. "You're bluffing," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Am I?" The broker pressed a button on the device, and a holographic projection sprang to life. It displayed schematics, intricate and detailed, overlaid with a series of encrypted codes. "These plans are worth more than any of your lives. That's why I've come for them." Vasquez didn't lower her weapon. "You're not leaving with that," she said. "Surrender now or I'll shoot." The broker's expression hardened. "You shoot me, and my associates will release this data to the highest bidder. You think this is over if you take me down? It's bigger than me, bigger than all of you." Joe, still clutching the flashlight, stepped forward. "You talk a big game for someone standing alone in the dark," he said. "But you forgot one thing." The broker turned slightly, his curiosity piqued. "And what's that?" Joe swung the flashlight with all his might, striking the device from the broker's hand. It clattered to the floor, the projection flickering and dying. The broker lunged for it, but Vasquez was faster, closing the distance and pinning him against the wall. "You're under arrest," she growled, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." The broker didn't struggle, his calm demeanor unnerving. "You think you've won," he said, his tone almost amused. "But you have no idea what's coming." Rachel rushed forward, scooping up the device. She examined it carefully, relief washing over her face. "It's intact," she said. "We can secure the data before anyone else gets their hands on it." "And we will," Vasquez said, dragging the broker toward the door. "Get the device to my team. They'll know how to handle it." As the police took the broker into custody, Clara and Rachel found a quiet moment to catch their breath. Clara sat on the couch, her head in her hands, while Rachel paced the room, the weight of years of secrets finally lifting. "Mom," Clara said softly, "what happens now?" Rachel stopped pacing, her gaze settling on her daughter. "Now! We try to move forward," she said. "The broker is just one piece of a larger puzzle. But with him out of the picture, we're safer than we've been in years." Clara looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and determination. "I don't want to live in fear anymore," she said. "I want to help. I want to make things right." Rachel's heart swelled with pride. "You already have," she said, pulling Clara into a tight embrace. "You're stronger than I ever imagined." Joe entered the room, his face lighting up with a grin. "Well, that was something," he said. "You two okay?" Clara nodded. "Thanks to you," she said. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Joe shrugged, a hint of embarrassment in his smile. "Hey, it's not every day a garbage man gets to play hero." Rachel smiled at him. "You're more than that, Joe. You've been a true friend to us, and I'll never forget it." Outside, Vasquez watched as the broker was loaded into a police van. She knew the battle wasn't over. The broker's cryptic warning lingered in her mind, a dark cloud over their hard-won victory. One of her officers approached. "Detective, we've analyzed the data from the device. It's a blueprint for a cyber weapon, something capable of massive destruction. If this fell into the wrong hands," Vasquez nodded grimly. "Then it's a good thing we stopped him," she said. Double the security on the evidence. I don't want any more surprises. The officer hesitated. There's one more thing. We've intercepted a message from one of the broker's associates. It seems he wasn't lying. There's a network out there, and they're not happy about losing their leader. Vasquez's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready, she said. This isn't over, but at least we're ahead for now. As the van drove away, Vasquez turned her gaze to the safe house. Inside, Clara and Rachel were finally finding a moment of peace, unaware of the battle still to come. But for now, the storm had passed, and that was enough. The early morning sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as Clara sat on the porch steps of the safe house. The events of the past few days played over in her mind, like fragments of a vivid nightmare. The sounds of shattering glass, raised voices, and the broker's chilling words haunted her, but so did the strength she'd found within herself. Rachel emerged from the house, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She handed one to Clara and sat down beside her, the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos they'd endured. I never wanted this for you, Rachel said finally, her voice thick with emotion. I tried so hard to keep you away from it all, to protect you. But I see now that you're stronger than I gave you credit for. Clara took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. You did what you thought was best, Mom. And maybe it wasn't perfect, but you taught me to fight for what matters. That's what got us through this. Rachel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're amazing, Clara. I don't know how I got so lucky to have you. The sound of footsteps interrupted their moment. Joe approached, his ever-present smile softening the weight in the air. Hope I'm not interrupting, he said, holding up a brown paper bag. But I thought we could all use some breakfast. Clara's face lit up. Joe, you're a lifesaver, he shrugged, settling onto the steps beside them. Hey, it's the least I can do after everything. You two deserve a little normalcy. As they ate, the conversation turned to lighter topics. For the first time in days, laughter echoed on the porch. But beneath the surface, they all knew the journey wasn't over. The broker's arrest was a victory, but it was only one battle in a larger war. Inside the house, Detective Vasquez coordinated with her team. The device retrieved from the broker was now secured in a high-tech evidence facility, its secrets being decrypted by experts. Reports trickled in about the broker's network, revealing a tangled web of operatives and operations spanning the globe. Vasquez glanced at the photo on her desk, a picture of her younger self with her late partner, Jack. He'd been killed during a sting operation years ago, a casualty of the same criminal network they were now dismantling. This case wasn't just professional for her, it was personal. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was one of her officers. Detective, we've got an update. The broker's associates are already mobilizing. They've issued a bounty for anyone who can retrieve the device or eliminate those involved in the operation. Vasquez's grip tightened on the phone. Understood. Double the security detail on the safe house. I want eyes on Rachel and Clara around the clock. Yes, ma'am. Hanging up, Vasquez leaned back in her chair. They'd won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that the broker's final words were more than an empty threat. Later that afternoon, Clara and Rachel met with Vasquez in the living room. The detective laid out their next steps, her tone firm but empathetic. Rachel, you and Clara will be placed in a new protection program, she said. Your identities will be changed and you'll be relocated. It's the best way to keep you safe. Clara frowned. How long will we have to stay hidden? Vasquez hesitated. As long as it takes to dismantle the network. We're making progress. But these things take time. Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. We'll do whatever it takes. I just want Clara to have a chance at a normal life. Clara's chest tightened. The thought of leaving behind everything familiar was daunting, but she understood the necessity. Will we ever be able to come back? She asked. Vasquez's gaze softened. I can't promise that, but I can promise we'll do everything in our power to keep you safe and give you a fresh start. Joe, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. What about the rest of us? The people who helped them? Vasquez turned to him. We'll offer protection to anyone who's at risk. You've already proven you're willing to fight for them, but this network won't hesitate to target anyone connected to Rachel and Clara. Joe nodded. Whatever it takes. I'm not letting them face this alone. As night fell, the group gathered for what felt like a final moment of peace before their lives changed forever. Rachel took Clara's hand, her heart heavy but hopeful. No matter where we go, she said, we'll have each other. And that's what matters. Clara leaned against her mother, drawing strength from her words. They'd faced danger and uncertainty, but they'd also discovered a bond that couldn't be broken. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready to face it together. The next morning, Clara stood at the edge of the safe house's driveway, her suitcase resting at her feet. The early light illuminated her face. A mixture of resolve and sadness etched into her features. Rachel stood beside her, a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder as they prepared to take the first steps toward their new lives. Detective Vasquez approached them, holding an envelope. These are your new identities, she said, handing it over to Rachel. Everything you need to start fresh is inside. Names, documents, and details about the town where you'll be living. It's quiet, safe, and far away from all of this. Rachel accepted the envelope with a nod. Thank you, Detective, for everything. Vasquez's expression softened. I'll be keeping you updated on the case's progress. We're closer than ever to dismantling the brokers' network. But in the meantime, focus on building your new life. You've earned that much. Joe appeared from the house, a backpack slung over his shoulder. He gave Clara a warm smile. Thought I'd walk you to the car, he said. Clara's lips quirked into a small smile. Thanks, Joe. For everything. They walked together in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. As they reached the car, Joe turned to her, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with sincerity. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Clara, he said. No matter where life takes you, don't forget that. And if you ever need me, I'll be there. Clara's eyes misted over as she hugged him tightly. I'll never forget you, Joe. Your family. Rachel joined them, placing a hand on Joe's arm. You'll always be part of our lives, no matter where we go. Joe gave them a reassuring nod, stepping back as Vasquez helped them into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, he stood in the driveway, watching until it disappeared from sight. He knew they were doing the right thing, but that didn't make saying goodbye any easier. The small town Rachel and Clara relocated to was as peaceful as Vasquez had promised. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, it was a far cry from the chaos they'd left behind. Clara found herself drawn to the quiet streets and the sense of normalcy she'd craved for so long. Rachel took a job at a local bookstore, finding solace in the simplicity of her new routine. Clara enrolled in the local high school, her nerves easing as she slowly made new friends. For the first time in years, they felt like they could breathe. But the scars of their past weren't so easily erased. At night, Rachel would sometimes wake in a cold sweat, the memories of the broker's threats still fresh in her mind. Clara, too, carried the weight of their experiences, though she channeled it into something positive. She joined a community outreach program, determined to make a difference and help others who felt powerless. One afternoon, as Clara walked home from school, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, and her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Inside was a note from Joe, accompanied by a photograph of him standing with Vasquez and a group of officers in front of a dismantled operation site. Clara, thought you want to see this. The broker's network is falling apart. Vasquez says we're making real progress. None of this would have been possible without you and your mom. You're stronger than you know, take care of yourself, kid. And remember, you've got a whole lot of people rooting for you, Clara clutched the letter to her chest, a wave of emotion washing over her. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. For the first time since leaving the city, she felt a spark of hope for the future. Months turned into a year, and life in the quiet town became their new normal. Clara excelled in school, her confidence growing with each passing day. Rachel found joy in her work, and even began to open up to new friendships. Though they still carried the shadows of their past, they were no longer defined by them. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Rachel turned to Clara with a smile. "You know, I think we've finally found our place." Clara nodded, her heart full. "Me too, Mom. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." In that moment, as the sky blazed with the colors of dusk, they knew they were ready to embrace the future. The broker's threats had once loomed over them, but now they were free to live, love, and rebuild. And though the journey had been harrowing, it had also taught them the strength of their bond and the resilience of the human spirit. As the last light of day faded, Clara reached for her mother's hand, their shared courage a beacon for the road ahead. Together, they would continue to rise, unbroken and unafraid.